Hey everyone, so with the PlayStation 5 still mostly out of stock even almost a year after launch as of this recording, I thought it'd be interesting to look at an upgrade that you can do to your existing PS4 or PS4 Pro. That is to upgrade the stock hard drive to a SATA SSD. This is something that I always wanted to test to see how an SSD will make a difference on the old console, since the SSD is a technology that Sony has touted as a killer feature of the PS5. I'll be testing this with my PS4 base model since I don't have a PS4 Pro at the moment. And speaking of the base PS4, the B-roll game footage that you're seeing now by the way is Crysis 3 Remastered running on that very same base PS4 with the SSD, which is something that I've always wanted to see since Crysis 3 was never released on the H-Gen consoles until very recently, even though it was released the same year the PS4 and Xbox One were launched. In a nutshell, it runs surprisingly well, except when loading checkpoints, where it momentarily freezes, even when it's running from the SSD. And from what I gather, this seems to be a specific issue to the PlayStation version of the game, and the issue is still prevalent at the time of this recording. So, back to this SSD comparison test. So before the swap, I've already recorded the footage of the games running on a stock hard drive, then I removed the drive and transferred all the contents of the hard drive to the SSD, and then re-ran the same games again. Please note that this is not meant to be a comprehensive guide on how to actually swap the hard drive out, as there are many online guides out there that you can refer to. You will however need to get ready a flash drive to download the latest PS4 firmware to install to the SSD. And another thing to note is that the base PS4 is only using SATA 2.0, which means you won't be able to take full advantage of modern SATA 3.0 SSDs. But as you will see later, there will still be noticeable improvements after the upgrade. This SSD that I'm using is a WD Green 1TB SSD, which is more budget oriented. So the first thing that I noticed after the swap is that the dashboard feels marginally smoother than before. Like when I'm scrolling through my game library, on the stock hard disk the thumbnails does take a second or two to load, but on the SSD is near instantaneous. One of the first games that I wanted to test was Spider-Man Miles Morales, because Spider-Man was one of the games that Sony used to demonstrate the super fast SSD load times of the then unannounced PS5 in the 2019 closed door demo, and I wanted to see for myself how much difference an SSD will make with the old gen consoles, particularly with Spider-Man. And since I couldn't find any footage of such tests on YouTube, and surprisingly even Digital Foundry didn't do this specific test with Spider-Man, I thought I'd do it myself. The SSD loaded the game in about 18 seconds, while the stock hard drive took more than 38 seconds, a significant improvement. Also, another thing I noticed is that on the hard drive, it does take a while for the main menu to load, as it shows Miles Morales in the background looking at his phone, whereas on the SSD, the menu instantly shows up as soon as Miles enters the screen. Unfortunately, I do not have a PS5 to compare the PS4 load times to, but just to give you an idea, I'm going to borrow footage from Giant Bomb's quick look of the game.
Look how fast that was.
That's very fast.
You think that was fast? You ready for this?
I'm ready.
Here goes. What? What?
That's crazy.
Man. It's
As you can see, it takes just over 2.5 seconds from the menu to the game, which is really blazing fast. Next up is the original Spider-Man itself, where the initial load times were about 20 seconds on the SSD and over 44 seconds on the hard drive. I then fast travelled from one location to another and measured the load times. The SSD just took over 14.5 seconds, whereas the stock hard drive took close to 30 seconds. Overall, a significant improvement. Even though the PS4 only has SATA 2 speeds, it doesn't have the advantage of the advanced SSD storage API that the PS5 has. Next game we're going to test is The Last of Us Part 2, where the initial load can take quite a while. On the SSD, it takes close to 56 seconds to load into game, whereas the hard drive took almost 1 minute and 15 seconds. So with the SSD, you basically shaved off about 19 seconds of load time, which is still pretty impressive. The last game we're going to test is The Last of Us Remastered. This was with the patch that was released not long before the PS5 was launched, that drastically reduced load times even on the standard hard drive. And the result is actually not much of a difference, with the SSD just being about 2 seconds faster than the hard drive, at least on the level that I tested here. So, some final thoughts after looking at these results. If you still find yourself unable to find a PS5, and you want to see for yourself how much difference an SSD will make on your existing PS4 games, or even on recent PS4 games that are also on PS5, to get an idea of the load time benefits of the PS5's SSD tech, an SSD upgrade might actually be quite viable. If you have a base PS4, since it's only limited to SATA 2, you may not necessarily need to get a top-of-the-line SATA SSD, as there won't be much speed benefit from it. But if you have PS4 Pro, then maybe spending a bit more for a higher end SSD might actually be worth your while. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching.